happy moment.
Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Kaiju Groupie Podcast, a show seeking to build a community of giant monster nerds through topical discussions with other fans just like you. I'm your host, Michael, better known as the Kaiju Groupie, and today I am joined by my good friend and fellow co-host of Kaiju Weekly Podcast, Travis Alexander. Travis, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing good. I am doing good. Having a great, just relaxing day today.
Excellent. Yeah, it feels a little weird being on this side of the table.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I know. It's like I'm laid back. I'm like, oh, I don't have to monitor I don't have to keep track of recording. I don't have to keep track of anything. I'm just along for the ride.
yeah, I mean that's when I asked you to do this, I thought it was appropriate to let you come on and be my first guest because, you know, I've told you this in private and I'll say it publicly. I would not be pursuing this passion project of mine without guys like you and some others that we've met in the community. So yeah, I mean, I thought it was super important to have you on for episode 1.
No, man, I'm really touched.
So before we kind of get into our main topic, let's let the people who don't necessarily know who you are, which I know that's very few and far between at this point, tell them a little bit about yourself. Tell us, give us some details, some insight into what it's like to be Travis.
Oh, well, it is very boring being me because I am just a simple nerd who just loves giant monster related things. Of course, started off loving, Godzilla and Ray Harryhausen movies. That's where my love of giant monster stuff kind of started. And yeah, I am the host of Kaiju Weekly along with another kind of a bum, he kind of lays around, doesn't really do very much, co-host of mine on that podcast. Just kidding, of course.
I've heard he's a real jerk too.
Yeah, he can be a jerk sometimes.
We all have that person in our lives that they're a little on the fringe of whether or not you still want to be friends with them or not.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, how did you kind of get into all this kaiju tokusatsu stuff? And feel free to share as much or as little as you want to.
Yeah, well, I've talked about it on Kaiju Weekly. That I like to say that I inherited my kind of fandom. Because my dad was a big Godzilla fan and he loved the Ray Harryhausen movies. And
sure,
as far back as I can remember, we would watch the Godzilla movies. Like there is not a moment in my life where I don't remember Godzilla being a part of it. And I have, some very strong memories of when I was a kid, playing with Godzilla figures and toys, and my great grandmother, who I didn't really know very well because she died when I was very young, but I remember going to see her before she died when she was in a nursing home. And the only thing that I remember about that day is that I had a Godzilla toy with me and I played with it while we were visiting her before she died. And so it's like Godzilla's just been this constant figure in my life. Throughout my whole life. And I'm just such a huge fan. One thing I always say is that, things like comic books, which I'm a huge fan of, things like Transformers and other things, my interest in them kind of comes and goes depending on, whether there's new TV shows out or new movies out at the time. Mm-hmm. But Godzilla I'm always up for some Godzilla. I'm always up for Godzilla stuff. So yeah, I've just been a fan for my entire life.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like we all in this community have a very similar story. Mine is sort of similar to yours. I've been a Godzilla fan for many, many years. It was my parents that helped get me into Godzilla. And I've talked about it over and over and over. And I'll talk about it just for a second here. You know, marathon, like cable television marathons, you know, my mom and dad, you know, God bless them for staying up, taking shifts all night just to record a movie marathon for their
Mm-hmm.
8-year-old, 7-year-old son. I can't remember how old I was at the time. I was fairly young. But yeah, they're the ones that got me into it. And of course, and like you, I am a huge Harryhausen fan.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really kind of what got me started, was watching some of those old Harryhausen films on TMC, AMC, back when they would show more of the classic movies like that, say on Saturday evening or maybe sometimes like Sunday morning, stuff like that. And that's how I got introduced into giant monsters and kaiju. It wasn't originally through Godzilla. It was through things like Harryhausen, obviously dinosaur movies like 1 million years BC
Oh
and
yeah.
Power Rangers from 93. I mean, that's how I got started.
Oh yeah.
And I know you have a very similar story. So I'll ask you, aside from Godzilla, because I think we can all agree that Godzilla is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
What other giant monster movie genre, or not giant monster movie franchises, genres, however you want to put it, like what other things are you into besides Godzilla?
Well, now, especially with doing the podcast, I have really gotten into a lot of different things. I've gotten into Ultraman, which I was never into Ultraman before,
Right.
partly because Ultraman just never really made a big hit here in the United States. But Gamera, I remember when I was a kid, because I constantly harassed my family to rent Godzilla movies, and sometimes they couldn't tell the difference between,
Yep.
one weird rubber suit monster and the next. They rented Gamera for me at one point, and I watched it and enjoyed it just as much as I did the Godzilla one, because it was just like, hey, here's another giant monster. I knew it wasn't Godzilla, but it was like, well, this is different. This is something new.
Right.
And and I really, back in the day, I loved Power Rangers, and so I've gotten into more of the Super Sentai stuff recently, Kamen Rider, all of that kind of stuff. I'm a nerd who likes weird things. Even like nerds would call me a nerd because of the weird stuff that I like.
Yeah, I think so too, because you know, growing up for me, I would see some of these old films on television like Reptilicus and Gorgo and some of these other fantastical movies. King Kong 33 was on a lot as a kid,
Hmm.
and I would always seek them out. Like I could care less as a child. I could have cared less about superhero movies, you know, and westerns and things like that, because I grew up in a time where you know, there were a lot of westerns on. Kids were, you know, kids my age at that period of time were big into cowboys and, you know, cowboys and Indians, you know, army, military movies, army men, you know, GI Joe, for instance, Ninja Turtles, and some others. And so, but I was never really into all that. I was
Hmm.
into giant rubber suited monsters, or
Yeah.
even claymation monsters through the Harryhausen films. And that sort of set me apart from even my friends who were who were equally as nerdy as I was, but they never reached the level of nerddom as me, in the case of me liking some of the more cheesier, campier movies like Gamera. See, my first exposure to Gamera, I want to say, was the original Gamera, not Super Monster, Jesus, Gamera the Invincible. I think it was. I
Hmm.
think it's what the U.S. title is.
Yeah, Gamera the Invincible.
Right. That was my first exposure to Gamera, and then years later, I got re-exposed to Gamera through Mystery Science Theater,
Hmm.
and to me, Gamera just became this silly, sort of this Godzilla knockoff, sort of this low rent Godzilla clone.
Hmm.
Uh, but as I've gotten older, and as I've dove deeper into sort of the history behind Godzilla, Tokusatsu, and and this whole genre in general, I've grown to appreciate some of those films that I didn't necessarily either understand or enjoy as a kid.
Yeah. Yeah, same. That's the same for me. I have definitely come to appreciate a lot of the movies I didn't really appreciate when I was a kid. Going back to Godzilla, one of the movies that used to annoy me as a kid was Godzilla versus Megalon. I
Oh
couldn't
yeah.
stand that movie as a kid because I was like, this is not fun. This is dumb. This is like I didn't like Jet Jaguar at all. But as an adult, I'm like, sure, I'll watch Godzilla versus Megalon anytime anybody wants to watch it with me. I enjoy that movie. I enjoy the heck out of it now. So yeah,
Okay.
you come to appreciate things a lot more now that you're an adult, and especially like you said with us diving deeper into it with the
Mhm.
podcasts.
Yeah, and that's the main reason. I had a conversation with David of the Kaiju Apostle a few weeks ago on his show, and um, I just mentioned that I sort of came back to I came back to the fold and came back to the fandom, if you will, back in 2014 with with the teaser of Godzilla 2014. And then
Hmm.
after that, my interest in it just sort of got reignited. Now it's not as intense as it is. It was not as intense as it is now. I think it like I think gasoline got poured on that fire in a big way,
Hmm.
ramping up to King of the Monsters. And because that's when I started my collecting journey, and that's when I started my journey of just I was on a mission to get every single film that I did not already have in my collection. And then a few months later, we had the Criterion collection. Now we've got the Gamera collection
Oh
coming.
yeah.
And you and we've talked about on Kaiju Weekly how both of us are sort of on our ultra journey right now. We've never really had the opportunity to watch and enjoy Ultraman here in the West. And now with Mill Creek putting out all this material, it's never been it's never been more of a good time to be a giant monster tokusatsu kaiju fan in general as it is right now.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, and that's what really got me started. Why I started Kaiju Weekly in 2017, towards the end of 2017, was because we already had the 2014 movie. We're ramping up towards King of the Monsters. Uh, Shin Godzilla had just come out earlier that year, or the year
Right.
before that, and then the anime trilogy was coming out at that same time. And it's like we were getting so much kaiju material, and then of course Pacific Rim and Pacific Rim Uprising, Rampage even came out around that time. So it's like so much was happening that I was like, I was like, I want to do a podcast about this stuff that I love.
Yeah. I mean, I think years ago it used you had to years ago you had to really dig for kaiju material. Like
Oh yeah.
even Godzilla material here in the
Hmm.
West was super hard to find. Um I remember being at my parents' house and on our old dial-up computer trying to log on because our internet was not great at the time, trying to log on to the promotional website for Godzilla 2000 to try
Hmm.
because I heard from some friends of mine, oh, they're making a new Godzilla movie, or whatever. This was post the 1998 movie and all that, and
Right. Yeah.
and they're making a brand new, and they were making one. I heard rumors and saw things, and I just happened to see it one day, and I was trying to get all this information because I was still a fan at heart. And, over the years, I've talked about this before too, that you just sort of fall in love. You sort of fall, excuse me, you sort of fall out of love with this stuff as you get older, you get mature, you kind of refocus your attention on other things. I joke about how being a Godzilla and Kaiju fan didn't get me a whole lot of dates in high school. So
Hmm.
you kind of got to refocus your attention elsewhere as you're growing up. But once you get older and you become more established and more comfortable in your own skin, um, then you just start to not really care what people think. And you're like, you know what? I like the things that I like, and I'm not going to change regardless of how much your family and friends make fun of you, because I know for a lot of people that I've talked to personally, Godzilla and kaiju is sort of an escape for them.
Mhm.
Um, an escape from maybe some bad circumstances in their life. I know um, David recently put out an episode where he talked with a fan, Faye, about, and then Faye mentioned that King of the Monsters was an escape, from
Mhm.
everything going on, and it was just it's that's true for, I feel like, a lot of people. That me growing up, Godzilla and all this and this whole genre was sort of an escapist thing, and it's still to a point for that. It's still to a point is that for me still. When I'm not feeling good, when I'm just not having a good day, and as silly as it sounds, and as childish as it may sound to a lot of people, because even adults have bad days.
Mhm.
I'll just throw on, I don't know, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, or Godzilla, or Mothra versus Godzilla from '64, and just sit and watch and enjoy. And yeah, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
Godzilla. Godzilla means so many different things to different people.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely does. And talking about, the scarcity of even Godzilla stuff back in the day, where I grew up, we didn't get a lot of very niche genre stuff around here. So Godzilla things were very hard to come by. And
Oh yeah,
I remember I went to the theaters and saw Godzilla 2000. Like anybody, any good Godzilla fan who was around at that time, I went to the
same.
theaters and saw it. And that was the last Godzilla movie that I knew of
Hmm.
existing for the longest time. I was like, well, they just stopped making Godzilla movies. I didn't think they were making any more. And then I remember clearly going to a Blockbuster, and I was looking through the different movies, and I see Godzilla X Mechagodzilla and Godzilla Tokyo SOS on the shelf. And I'm like,
Hmm.
wait, what is this? I know all the Godzilla movies. This is not a Godzilla movie I've seen before. And found out that, wait, there's an entire series of Godzilla movies that took place after Godzilla 2000, and I
Hmm.
didn't know about it. And so I was like, at that point, I got back into it, and I got back into it just enough time for just a few years later for Final Wars to come out. And so I was actually able to pick it up at the store when it was released here in the United States.
Yeah.
So it was just like just that's how scarce things were, that I missed the entire Millennium era, the entire Millennium series, but while it was coming out, and I had to go back and watch it all after the fact.
Same with the Heisei series. And
Hmm.
I remember, because here in the West, Godzilla, the only real distribution we got here in the United States was the Showa films. That's
Hmm.
what we got. We got, Terror of Mechagodzilla, Mothra versus Godzilla, Godzilla's Revenge, which I've grown to appreciate in its own way over the years. That's what we got. Godzilla versus the Sea Monster was on a lot on
Oh yeah.
AMC, or even Gojira was on a lot. Oddly enough, the American version, not the Japanese version.
Right.
I didn't see the Japanese version until, many, many years later. But I didn't even know that there was such a movie like Godzilla versus Destroya. I didn't know that
Hmm.
until one day my aunt came over and handed me 3 cassette tapes: Godzilla versus Biollante, Godzilla versus Destroya, and Godzilla versus King Ghidorah from 1991. And I watched those things until the tape wore out. That's how
Hmm.
often I watched them. So yeah, I mean, growing up, it sounds stupid when you actually say it like this, but it's sort of there's truth to it. Growing up as a Godzilla fan in the West, especially, was hard because you didn't have the stuff we have now. You don't have
Right.
access to we didn't have the Criterion channel, or we didn't have HBO Max, or some of these other out, or even YouTube, archive.org, stuff like that, where we have
Hmm.
access to all this stuff. We didn't have that growing up. And so
Yeah.
that's why I appreciate this so much.
Yeah, I've been helping my cousin, who's only 15 years old, on his kind of kaiju journey. and I've been watching a lot of the Godzilla movies with him, and right now he is. I think there's only like 4 movies of all of the Godzilla movies that he hasn't seen yet.
Mm-hmm.
And at 15 years old, when I was 15 years old, there were no Godzilla movies available for us to watch.
Oh, I know.
And
Tell me about it.
so it's like how much the times have changed for kaiju fans, and I love it. I love it. I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean it's fantastic. It's fantastic. But we can spend all day on this portion of the conversation, but I want to kind of get into our main topic, and really it's a perfect segue, because we're talking about how we kind of grew up with Godzilla and what it means to us. And it
Mhm.
always, and that kind of gives us some really positive feelings, towards the fandom. But in recent years or so, there has been sort of these portions of the fandom that don't seem as let's see, what's the best way to put this, that don't seem as positive and a little bit toxic. So, Travis, I know that you're usually a very, very positive person. So, from your perspective right now, I think I asked this question of somebody else earlier on another podcast, but I'll ask you here. What is your health assessment, sort of, as of the Godzilla fandom as it stands right now?
As it stands right now, I would give it a B, either a B or a B minus.
Okay.
If you give it like a grading system like that, because I don't think the fandom is for Godzilla fandom, for Kaiju fandom. I don't think it's that bad as far as the toxicity is concerned. There's always going to be toxic fans in
Mhm.
every fandom. Uh,
Right.
but if you compare it to other ones like the Star Wars fandom, or some of the other ones, even comic book fans, kaiju fans aren't as toxic, or we don't have as many toxic people in here as some of those do. And maybe it's because we're still not at that like mainstream level that like Star Wars and comic books are at.
Mhm.
Because comic books have become now pop culture.
Right.
They are part of the regular pop culture that everyone is exposed to. So I mean, my grandmother knows who Rocket Raccoon is, and even I couldn't have told you who Rocket Raccoon was, like 10 years ago.
Right.
So it just shows that that they've become very mainstream, and I think that because we haven't hit the mainstream in the kaiju community, maybe that has kind of kept some of the toxicity down. But
Mhm.
it definitely exists. It
Yeah.
definitely exists, and I think that we just like any fandom, you just have to pick and choose who you interact with, and
Mhm.
what parts of the fandom you want to interact with and to avoid.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, because I posted in the Kaiju Groupie Facebook group, I think a few weeks ago. We were talking about toxicity or something like that, and one of the members made the comment, and they said that the Godzilla fandom is so toxic. It is so toxic. And from my perspective, I'm sort of like you, Travis. I don't think the fandom itself is toxic.
Yeah.
I think that the fandom is kind of small right now. It feels big because we're all kind of talking in this bubble to each other. It feels big to us because we're having conversations like you and me here. We're having conversations with guys like Monsters versus Men, Gargantucast, and some others, and in our little groups of kaiju fans. And so the
Hmm.
so the fandom feels huge to us right now. But in
Yeah.
reality, it's not. It's not a big fandom, honestly. Um, I may catch a little bit of flack for saying that, but it's really not a huge fandom. So when toxicity or negativity does come in, it feels more amplified, because where the fandom is so small and the fandom is so niche, and you really don't have, there's not a whole lot of issues as far as cultural issues, socioeconomic issues, stuff like that, that gets touched on within the fandom a whole lot. So when something does come, it feels almost world ending because it's turned up to 11 because, you know, uh, it just
Yeah.
becomes more because the fandom is so small, it just the problems become more obvious. That's probably the best way I know how to put it.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to what your definition of toxicity is because um, does the Godzilla fandom have quite a few jerks in it? Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, there's definitely a bunch of jerks in here. Does that necessarily mean they're toxic? No, I think you can be a jerk and not be a toxic fan because you can just be, you can just be a pain in the butt.
Mhm.
But toxicity in a fandom comes when a person, at least in my definition, comes when a person is actively trying to ruin the enjoyment of this thing for someone else,
Mhm.
or they're actively doing something to harm the joy that another person is feeling. In the Star Wars fandom, we see it all the time with people who enjoy a certain movies. If you enjoy the new trilogy, if you enjoy the prequel trilogy, and the people who come out who's not like, well, I don't like them. That's not toxic. It's the people who are like, how dare you like those things?
Mhm.
Or you're
Yeah.
not a true fan for liking those things. That's where it becomes toxic. And
Oh,
so
man.
that's where I think, like I said, with the Godzilla fandom, we may have some jerks, and I think that people may view that as the toxic side of the Star Wars fandom, or the Godzilla fandom, I mean. But I don't think just having people who are opinionated or jerks necessarily makes it toxic. It's the ones who are trying to actively ruin the enjoyment for other people that makes it toxic. And we just, from my experience, we don't have as many as other fandoms do.
Travis, let me ask you, from your perspective, do you think we have a gatekeeping problem within the kaiju fandom?
Um, it has become more of a problem within the last couple of years. If you had asked me like 2 years ago, I would have said, "Oh no, we don't have a problem." It seems we are at least
Mhm.
nowhere near as bad as what other fandoms do. But it is starting to become a little bit more of a problem
Mhm.
that I've noticed lately. But I still feel like we don't have a problem as much with that because the way that the nature we just talked about, the nature of being exposed to Godzilla things, especially in the West. We didn't all get exposed to Godzilla at the same time. And
True.
we didn't all get to watch the movies at the same time because some of us, were in areas where the movies got released and we got to go to the movie, to the rental place, to Blockbuster or whatever, and we could rent the movie right away. Some of us, we had to wait years before we could even get a copy of the movie after it was released. So there's not a lot of gatekeeping because it's like, oh, you haven't seen this particular Godzilla movie. Most people don't react with, how dare you? You're not a true fan if you haven't seen this. It's more of, oh, you weren't exposed to this. You should check it out. And we're kind of going through that again with the Ultraman. With since it's now making a big impact here in the United States, you have people who were more familiar with Ultraman, and
Mhm.
they're like, "Oh, well, this is fun. This reminds me of the stuff I watched, when it did make a few appearances here in the United States." And then you have people like me who've never watched Ultraman, and I'm like, I have no idea what's going on in this, but I'm just along for the ride, and we're just kind of all enjoying it in our own way. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's a lot of gatekeeping. For me, gatekeeping, when I think of gatekeeping, I think of the comic book fandom, which I'm also, a big comic book fan.
Right.
And there are people who actively try to prevent new comic book fans from coming in. They're like, we don't want new fans. We only want the ones that are already here. And I don't see that in the Godzilla fandom.
I don't believe we've reached that level yet. It's always been my fear, though, that, for instance, we were talking about Godzilla versus Kong earlier.
Hmm.
We touched on a little bit with 2014 with the legendary. Let's just say the MonsterVerse as
Hmm.
a whole. Um, the big divides within the community that I've seen come between the people who like Legendary and the people who like the anime and Shin Godzilla, the more traditional Toho, the people who like what Toho produces and then what the American companies produce. That's where
Right.
sort of the divide is. I see, and this is not a knock on what Legendary is doing. I'm grateful for what we've gotten so far. And I love King of the Monsters. And with
Mhm.
all of its flaws, I love King of the Monsters. But like you said, Travis, it really depends on where you're coming in from. Like, for instance, if you're coming in at, say, if you came into the fandom at, say, 2014, I mean, you've been around a few years. You've had time to get if you're serious about being, a Godzilla fan, and I'm not saying you have to be serious. It's not like life or death. You must be serious. You must
Right.
be a Godzilla fan or else. But
Mhm.
if it is something you're interested in, if it is something that you want to kind of pursue as sort of your fandom life, best way I know how to put it,
Yeah.
you've had some time to consume, I'd say, a good amount of Godzilla media between 2014 and 2019 when King of the Monsters came out. But I see arguments between these older fans, the guys and girls that have been around since the 60s,
Yeah.
that grew up with the Showa era, that actually grew up going to the theaters while Godzilla versus Hedorah was in theaters.
Mhm.
Guys and girls like that. I see them interacting with each other, and I don't think that there's any sort of ill will involved. I just don't know if we know how to talk to each other, really,
Yeah.
because everything is so digitized now. Everything is online, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of it. All of these groups now, you can join a group pretty easily these days and be instantly transported into like this little section of the community where everyone's talking at once, and you don't really, and if you're a brand new fan, that can be very overwhelming. So they come in, they say, hey, so why is King Ghidorah named Monster Zero? And then you've got certain fans that'll say, well, don't you know that
Mhm.
he's Monster Zero in Godzilla versus the Astro Monster? Haven't you seen that one? And it just becomes, and sometimes, yes, I will say this, that sometimes there are assholes in the
Mhm.
fandom that just want to be buttholes, but
Right.
sometimes I think that it's just the lapse, I guess, the lapse in communication, like the communication barrier. It's the mediums that it's the media that we're kind of using to communicate with one another.
Mhm.
If, say, like when we're talking over Facebook and you're scrolling through and you read a comment, depending on how that comment is worded, you could take it either bad or good. You could take that person as being sarcastic and cynical, or you could take them as being helpful or whatever. It just really depends on, I think it comes down to the fact that we just don't know how to talk to each other. We don't know how to disagree with one another without getting angry. I think that's one of the main problems that I see in the
Yeah.
community.
Yeah, and a big part of that, and goes deep into like psychology and everything, but
Right.
of how people uh embrace things that they're fans of, the things that they love, and they actually make it a part of their identity.
Mhm.
I'm a Godzilla fan. That is my identity, and if you insult that, you're insulting me.
Right.
And so, I think that's the dangerous side of being a fan of something, is when you become so attached to it that it becomes almost like a replacement for yourself. And when someone may insult a movie that you really like,
Mhm.
and that movie is a part of your identity,
Right.
and you feel insulted.
Right.
and that's where a lot of the anger and frustration comes from. And so for me, as much as I love Godzilla, as much as I love kaiju, I think that for me, I have found that it's important to keep that stuff in its right place. At
Right.
the end of the day, at the end of it all, no matter what socio-political kind of messages are in the films, no matter what themes are in the films, no matter what mood is set in the films, these are films about giant monsters. They're inherently silly. They're going to be, they're not something that we need to defend with our lives because they're just movies. They're just movies about giant monsters. And as much as I love them, and as much as I grew up with them, and as much as they are a part of my childhood and my adulthood, I think that keeping it in its proper place, it goes a long way in staying positive
Right.
when people, yeah, go ahead.
I think you're right, and what you just said there kind of reminds me of something that I think it was Chris from Kaiju Apostle said on an episode where we're not defined by our passions.
Mm-hmm.
We're ultimately defined by how we treat people and how we interact with the world around us. And I think you're right. And I know you're right. I don't think you're right. I know you're right. At the end of the day, these are just movies. These are just guys in rubber suits. And as taboo as that probably is to say in this
Yeah.
fandom, these are just actors. They're actors and actresses on screen, that put on a very good performance for us to enjoy. And, we're not defined by our passions. We're not defined by this fandom. We're defined by, how we treat our family, our friends, and how we, our faith, how we interact with our faith too. So,
Yeah,
um,
I think that's something that me and you and Steven, whenever he was part of Kaiju Weekly, our previous co-host, one thing that we strive to do is to not take ourselves and the movies that we're watching too seriously.
right.
It goes down to our rating system. We rate the movies out of Godzukis. like
Yeah, we
like
do.
I don't want we don't want to be the definitive voice on these movies. We don't want to be and we haven't yet, but we may get comments at some point being like, how dare you, or why did you give this movie 3.5 Godzukis when you gave this other movie 4, but you said you like this one better. And it's like, we're scoring it out of Godzukis, the dumb, flying dragon monster that was in a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. It's like, don't take it so seriously. If tomorrow I may change my mind and be like, well, I don't really like the Godzuki score that I gave it. I may change my mind tomorrow about it. But so that's why I say we're about having fun in our podcast, Kaiju Weekly, and we just don't take it very seriously. The way that other people do. And I get that criticism and critics is a job. That is a job that people do, and it's a
Mhm.
job that people take seriously. And so we're not trying to be movie critics. We're just trying to have fun while talking about silly monster movies.
Right. I mean, if anyone, I'm just trying to wrap my head around if that ever happened and we got an email, or you got an email rather, on Kaiju Weekly, and they're like, how dare you give Godzilla versus Mecha Godzilla 3 Godzukis, or how dare you not like King Caesar, Travis?
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
but you're right, it's inherently silly. And I've done the same thing you've done. I've watched movies that I've probably given a score of 2, went
Hmm.
back, maybe given it a 3 because circumstances, whatever I was going through that day, probably clouded my vision or clouded my opinion on that particular film in that particular moment. So, all this stuff is just sort of malleable. It can change at a given moment. So, we've talked about some of the negative stuff in the fandom. We've kind of touched on a little bit of the positive stuff, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into the more positive aspects of this fandom. So, Travis, from your perspective, why would someone coming in, say 2014, or maybe a little earlier, let's say in the mid 2000s to 2014, why would they even want to be in this community at all?
And that's a good question, because for the longest time I wasn't really part of the community of kaiju fans. I was a kaiju fan myself, and that was it. I wasn't communicating with other people who liked this thing, and I think you're fully able to, and it's fully okay to be a fan of something and not communicate and not interact with the community at large. But I think that if you're going to be a part of this community, you're coming into it because you want to have someone to talk to about something that you love,
Right.
and you want to find like-minded individuals. The problem is when you come into the community looking for like-minded individuals and you find out, oh, not everyone is like-minded. It happened to me when I joined the community at large and really started talking to other kaiju fans. I found out, oh wow, not a lot of people like Final Wars. And I just automatically assumed everyone loved Final Wars because I loved Final Wars.
Right.
And so then I come into this community and I find out, oh, not everyone is like-minded. But you know what? That's okay, because we don't have to all be like-minded. We don't have to all like the same exact things. We still all like Godzilla for different reasons, and we all like different Godzilla movies. And so finding different perspectives is a great part of the kaiju community, and being exposed to things that you wouldn't have been exposed to before. Like, I would not know a lot about some of the other kaiju films outside of Godzilla, Gamera, the big ones,
Right.
if it wasn't for the community that I got involved in. So I do appreciate the community, and I think that is something that people can enjoy when they come into it.
Yeah, it's sort of like a little family, because and I say that because I don't want to sound too hokey, but the reason I say it's sort of like a family is because we are a lot smaller than, say, Star Wars, Marvel, comic books in general, Star Trek. I can go on. My Little Pony. I can go on and on and on about fandoms I feel are much broader than Godzilla, Tokusatsu, and Kaiju. So really, when you come in, you're kind of getting, a little family of people that come from different walks of life, different life circumstances. They grew up in different eras. A lot of times, we've got older fans, like I said, from, like I was talking earlier, that grew up
Mhm.
during the 60s and 70s, in what I would call the golden age of kaiju. And then you've got fans that are coming in even in 2019 with King of the Monsters. Maybe they're in middle school. They saw a King of the Monsters poster. They thought it looked cool. They said, "Hey, I'm going to go see this movie," and then the rest is history. So you are getting sort of this knit niche family. you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the good things about it. And you're right. A lot of the folks that I see come in, into for example, in the Kaiju Groupie the Facebook group, um, they're asking a lot of questions. Some of them are, and you can tell the newer fans from some of the veteran, what I call the veteran fans.
Mhm.
Um, you can tell the difference between them in just sort of the way they communicate. You can tell sort of some of the things obviously some of the things they post, but the way they communicate with other folks in the fandom, you can tell that their maturity level and their experience level with this fandom is higher than some others. And really,
Mhm.
to me, trying to keep the community positive, trying to maintain a very positive outlook is really not too difficult. You can do it for the most part. All you have to do is learn a little bit of empathy. Really,
Oh, yeah.
it comes down to empathy, honestly. Empathy for your fellow fan, empathy to know that at the end of the day, these are just movies, and these are just movies about fake creatures. But at the end of
Yeah.
the day, you have to remember you are talking to a real person on the other
Right.
side of that screen. And you
And you
have to
don't
keep that in mind.
and you don't have to agree with a person to empathize with them.
No, you don't. You
And
don't.
and I think a good example of that for me is the Monsters versus Men podcast. Our friends Alex and Eric. Eric is fairly new. You know, he's only really been a fan of Godzilla over the last year because he just wasn't interested and never really got into Godzilla movies before that and never got into kaiju stuff before that. And he has gone on this journey. You know, the entire premise of their podcast is him going on this journey of watching all of the Godzilla movies in order. Now they're moving on to Gamera, then they're going to move on to Kong. And like, so he's going through this journey of all these kaiju films. And whenever they get to their like rankings and ratings, you know, and I love listening to them. I listen to them every week. But whenever it gets to the rankings and ratings, I always struggle because Eric will rate certain movies that I don't really like that much higher than the ones that I really like. And sometimes he'll even rate the ones I really like. There are some of my favorite movies really low. And, you know, I get that little twinge of, oh, why are you rating the thing I love so low? But then I remember he's new. He's coming into this new. So the movies that he loves are the movies that make him feel a certain way
Mhm.
now because of his experiences now. My favorite Godzilla movies are the ones that remind me of being a kid and watching these movies. Well, he doesn't
Right.
have that. He doesn't have this experience of, oh man, I remember watching this when I was, you know, 8 years old and just loving this. And yeah, it's cheesy, but man, I loved it when I was a kid. He didn't have that. So the movies that he likes are different than the movies that I like.
Mhm.
And that's okay. We still, me and him still love the same, you know, we still love all the movies and we still appreciate them for what they are. But I just love that we have different perspectives on it. And now that I understand, I kind of, you know, talked myself into remembering the different perspectives that we have. I am okay with, you know, he can rate one, you know, a movie that I love the worst movie in the franchise, and it doesn't bother me because it's like, well, you know, that's just because of your perspective of it, and it's fine for you to have that opinion. It's fine for me to have a different opinion.
Yeah, it's truly been fascinating. It really has been fascinating to listen. And I know we single out their show a lot for various reasons, but I'll do it here because it's been fascinating to listen as they go through this franchise, film by film, and
Hmm.
just hearing Eric's how Eric has evolved in his thinking over these past like 30 some weeks.
Hmm.
How his thinking how he's thinking about these films more, and how he's diving deeper into them, and how I hear it in his voice. He may tell me differently, but I hear it in his voice that he's becoming a true fan. He really is, and not the Michael Daughtery true fan,
Right.
but the true fan, like a really diehard fan who has this perspective that you have this different perspective, you know, coming in as a brand new person to the fandom, and just having a genuine interest in what is going on here.
Hmm.
Um, so I mean, it's good stuff. It really is good stuff. But you know, I've got one more question that I kind of want. I got one more, you know, subtopic that I want to cover really quick, and then we can kind of end it here. So, Travis, you know, there's a lot of wonderful things about this fandom. You know, we've talked about, you know, how it's a family, how it's really kind of a unique place to be, aside from sort of the more mainstream fandoms like Star Wars and Marvel and some others.
Hmm.
It's less toxic than even those. You know, for all of the conflicts that we do see pop up, fortunately, they are, from my perspective, and I'm thinking probably maybe from your perspective, they are pretty few and far between. For the most part, the Godzilla fandom and the Kaiju fandom at large is pretty civil to one another, and we really genuinely do want to help each other. We really want
Hmm.
to help each other learn and experience these movies, sometimes from a different perspective, you know. Um, but there's always things that we can maybe do better. And so, Travis, I'll ask you, you know, what is some things that the fandom is doing right? And then from your perspective, what is some things that the fandom is doing wrong?
Um,
or could be doing. I'm sorry, they could be doing better. Let's just
Could
say
be
they're not.
doing better.
They could be doing better. They're not wrong. I don't want to say someone is wrong, but they could be doing it
Right.
better.
As far as doing better, I think that there are people who still have that mentality of, oh, I want to keep this niche. I don't want it to become mainstream. I don't want it to become as popular as Marvel, because then it'll ruin it. And I think that mentality comes from, like I said, the toxicity that comes from those other fandoms. They see it in those fandoms and they're like, well, I don't want that here. But I think that we need to remember the only way that we're going to continue to have people who love Godzilla is if we let new people come in who will learn to love Godzilla or kaiju in general. It's like, it's like Western movies. Western movies are not popular right now. Why? Because majority of people nowadays, past a certain generation, don't enjoy Western movies the way they did back in the old days. It was a generational thing. And because you don't have new fans who came into it, it's kind of died out for the most part. There's exceptions, but it's mostly died out. So yes, we have a lot of great kaiju movies coming out right now, and we're going to have more hopefully coming out soon. My advice to everyone is more fans does not mean a bad thing. It's not a bad thing that more fans are coming in. We just need to make sure that we're welcoming to those new fans, because they don't have the connection that we have. They didn't grow up watching it. They didn't watch, Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, when they were 6 years old and fall in love with that gold dragon and everything and how cool he was. They don't have those things. So we need to remember that they're going to have a different perspective on these movies because they didn't grow up with them. But if they love them just as much as we do, then embrace it and be helpful towards them.
Okay. I mean, that's I have nothing. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. I could not have said it better. It's like we talked about, it just really comes down to empathy. It really does.
Yeah.
And so, Travis, I really want to thank you for, taking the time out of your busy schedule and talking with me on this. Like I told you at the top of the show, this is sort of a passion project for me. This is sort of a little side gig that I'm going to start doing. I want to have more of these conversations with people within the community.
Yeah.
And since you're one of the more positive people that I know that I get to communicate with on a day-to-day basis, I thought it would be appropriate to have you on first and talk about some positivity and maybe give a little bit of, take a little bit of a more lighthearted approach and break up some of the stuff that maybe we see going on around us. So I hope that this is going to be helpful for somebody, especially a new fan.
Oh yeah, I am an unapologetic optimist, and I always will be. So I know that it's not the cool thing to be optimistic nowadays, but I am an unapologetic optimist.
You mean you don't want to be some broody hipster just sitting in the back of the coffee shop, just hating life and wondering and questioning all of your life choices?
And just not just my own life choices, but the people who are cynical question everything. They question the motives of other people. They question the reason for things happening, and it's like, that's too much effort. That is too much effort to be angry all the time.
You're right, it is, and it's just a really terrible way to live.
Yeah.
So I said that was my last question, but I'm going to ask you one more question.
Okay.
And this one does not have to be necessarily kaiju or tokusatsu related. It can be anything.
Okay.
And it's simply this. What are you binging right now? And that can be books, TV, movies, and it can be even non-kaiju tokusatsu related. Just what are you binging right now?
Well, I know you've opened up to anything, no, not even non-kaiju related stuff. And I was thinking about, I was like, well, what non-kaiju stuff have I been binging? I really haven't been binging that much. The stuff that I've been binging recently has been within the world of kaiju. I have been trying to familiarize myself more with Kamen Rider and with
Mhm.
Ultraman, because you have the big three, which are the big three tokusatsu series that have been going on forever in
Right.
Japan. And there's so many seasons. It's Super Sentai, Kamen Rider, and Ultraman. Those three things have been going on forever, and there's so many seasons of them. And I was like, I knew some of them. I've watched some, but I haven't watched a lot. And so I'm trying to familiarize myself. So I have binge watched Ultraman Orb recently, which I just recently finished. Really
Yep.
enjoyed it. Had some issues with it, but really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
I know you were giving me the play-by-play.
Yeah, I was giving you the play-by-play. But the one thing that I do want to, and I will, and you know what's coming, Kamen Rider W.
Uh-huh.
I
Yep.
binge watched that entire series, and it is my favorite tokusatsu series I have ever seen. It is so good. I love that. I love that series so much. So
Maybe
yeah.
for your birthday, Travis, we'll cover it on Kaiju Weekly.
That'd be great. I love
Yeah.
Kamen Rider W. It is so good. So
Yeah.
that's what I've been binge watching.
Okay, that's fair, and I think, like I said, you've given me sort of the play-by-play of Ultra Orb and even Kamen Rider, and so I'm yet to watch that. I need to sit down and watch that for sure, so that me and you can have something else to talk about,
Yes.
like we need
Yeah.
another thing to talk about.
Right, exactly.
Um,
I need someone to talk to me about Kamen Rider W.
all
So
right,
if anybody listens to this and you've watched Kamen Rider W, message me on Twitter or something, because I need people to talk to about Kamen Rider W. I love that series so much.
oh, that's awesome. So, before we go, Travis, I want to give you one. I want to give you another opportunity to give some plugs for Kaiju Weekly, everything that is going on with the podcast, outside of the podcast. So go ahead and just tell whoever's listening, anything and everything about Kaiju Weekly.
Yeah, so you can listen to the Kaiju Weekly podcast. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We have a YouTube channel that you can subscribe to, and we post new episodes and clips from old episodes on there. We are a weekly kaiju related podcast, which is actually, I have found out, rare, because most kaiju podcasts are either bi-weekly or bi-monthly, depending on how you want to say it, or
Mhm,
monthly.
mhm.
And I made the poor decision of naming the podcast Kaiju Weekly, so we're kind of locked into doing a weekly episodes.
It's
Uh,
true. Yeah.
but yeah, so anybody can listen to that podcast. You can also follow the podcast at Kaiju Weekly on Twitter, Kaiju Weekly Pod on Instagram. You can follow me at Captain Travis 55 on Twitter. Although I do spend most of my time tweeting out from the Kaiju Weekly account, just because most of my tweets are kaiju related anyway, so I keep it on that. Yeah, and like I said, the YouTube channel. We also have a Patreon page, Kaiju Weekly Pod, or patreon.com/Kaiju Weekly Pod. So if anybody wants to or feels like they're able to, they can support us on Patreon. We're going to need that support coming up soon. Well, not sooner rather than later, but next year, because we're thinking of putting on a panel at next year's G Fest.
Oh yeah.
So, and the only way we're going to be able to afford to do that and afford to make the trip to G Fest is with some support from Patreon. So if anybody wants to help us reach our goal of hosting a panel on at G Fest next year, you can help us by going to Patreon. We also sell t-shirts. I don't really talk about it a lot on the actual podcast, but we have t-shirts at TeePublic. So you can check out our merch store, and they are just a bunch of fun designs that I come up with whenever I have something really weird and silly that I want to put on a t-shirt.
And they're all fantastic. I think my favorite has been the Welcome to Monster Island T-shirt.
Mm-hmm.
I know our friend Nathan has already purchased his own T-shirt for Monster Island, and the Justice for Baragon shirt. We got to mention the Justice for Baragon shirt.
Yep. Hashtag Justice for Baragon.
Absolutely. Although I will say Justice for Anguirus. After that Mechagodzilla episode you and I did on Kaiju Weekly, I'm going to have to say Justice for Anguirus, but that's a whole other can of worms.
Anguinus, Anzilla. According to HBO, his name's Anzilla.
Oh, goodness. Don't get me started.
Oh, man. I hope they never change. I just hope they never change them. I hope they stay messed up because that is just hilarious to me.
Oh, it absolutely is. But yeah, they're great designs if you guys want, and they're pretty inexpensive too. So, there's a lot of, if you're familiar with the TeePublic platform, you know what I'm talking about. Just go check it out. It's tpublic.com/Kaiju Weekly. Am I right?
TeePublic's URLs are kind of weird because it's like tpublic.com/user/ whatever. So if you search for Kaiju Weekly, you'll eventually find it. I'll also put links. I have links in the in our like social medias and stuff, so people can find it.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to put links to all the stuff that Travis just mentioned in the show notes of this episode. So before we head out of here, I just want to say thank you, Travis, for joining me again. It's been a fun conversation. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And of course, until next time, I'm Michael Hamilton, the Kaiju Groupie, signing off. Thank you for listening to the Kaiju Groupie Podcast, a podcast produced and hosted by Michael Hamilton using redcircle.com. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to continue this conversation, please email me directly at kaijugroupiepod@gmail.com. Also, follow us on social media by joining the Kaiju Groupie Facebook group, on Twitter at Kaiju Groupie Pod, and on Instagram at The Kaiju Groupie. The show is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find your favorite giant monster podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review the show. This will help spread the word to other Kaiju and Tokusatsu fans, and if you do, I promise I'll read your comments on the next episode. All film, audio clips, and graphics belong to their respective copyright holders with no infringement being intended or implied. So until next time, I'm Michael, the Kaiju Groupie, signing off.